I am my age. Have designed and will teach a course on the geopolitics of the Arctic, if you can believe this. It's more than being cool, I tell you that. So security is clearly must be defined, even with Russia, in ways that are different from what they are now. And this is a matter in which leadership is really possible. How you lead if you simply respond to perceived or maybe occasionally real threats of the military, of a military nature is not the way to lead. Thirdly, I'll briefly allude to the Apec summit, which was held in Vladivostok, in which I was deeply involved, both in the planning of it by the Russians, who treated it interestingly. It's on one level, it was simply a coming out party, much as the way the Olympics are going to be in Abkhazia. Now it's no longer Georgia.
Sochi.
Sochi. That's right. I've actually been there, believe it or not, in the Cold War. I can't. It's all very confusing. But whatever. The Olympics are simply going to be treated the same way. They spent $21 billion rebuilding Vladivostok. But the second meeting, the meeting that was held in October, which I did attend, was really a free-for-all. It was primarily peopled by bureaucrats. Again, I was the only American involved, if you can believe it. And they were really arguing about issues that were germane to their jurisdictions, even though a ministry for creating Russia east of the Urals was created. I may be uncreated soon, I don't know, because there clearly is no fixed, strong policy on that. So the APEC experience, which did create a Far Eastern Federal University, which was done simply by throwing together 4 regional universities and tripling the salary of the people that worked there, which I thought was very original, if nothing else, is not going to do much unless it becomes an international research university that deals with developing Russia east of the Urals. That would make a huge amount of sense, but that is subject to the bureaucratic infighting in Moscow. Finally, and I will end with this, what is U.S. policy? Well, I've already hinted at what I really think it ought to be. I think that it involves, first of all, humility. It's a recognition that American values and American power in relative terms are declining. It doesn't mean we're disappearing, but it is a starting place for taking initiatives, not from strength, not from because we just won World War II, which is why everybody is following us, but rather because we are still, we believe in them. I mean, I would be in jail in Russia or China probably in 15 minutes if I lived there. But the point is that we live in a world of diversity. The universality of values and the need for creating institutions that build in this diversity is absolutely essential. And it requires a whole different kind of statesmanship as well as leadership. And strategic thinking has got to be set by policy, not by events, which is unfortunately what has really happened since the end of the Cold War. And I think it should include both globalization, or both regionalism and global institutions. The notion that we still do not have a universal energy regime is in many ways a symbol of it. When you got China as the rogue consumer and Russia as the rogue producer, and neither one is a full member of the IEA, strikes me as being another one of these bizarre things. So my point, professorial and unusual, I suppose, is that instead of letting the agenda being set by people, particularly within Russia or within Russia and East Asia, that you should begin to take initiatives which still are available to us to figure this out, anticipate, and try to do something which projects American leadership into a regime that will inevitably get stronger. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Don. I should just say that Don is the same as a colleague as he is on the panel, so never a dull moment. Now we're going to hear from Matthew Ouimet.
Today ends my successful career of trying desperately to avoid coming after Don Hellman on a panel. I am very honored to be here today. I have a lot of connections here. Well, Herb Ellison was my dissertation advisor. He was my mentor. He was a good friend. 23 years ago, Don Hellman and Herb Ellison invited me to join them as co-author of a USIP-funded study on the Russia-Japan relationship. That basically began my professional career. I continue to write on that issue now for the State Department. And I continue to remain grateful to Don and to Herb for trusting a young graduate student at the time to take on those kinds of responsibilities. I also owe a great debt to the Wilson Center. After I finished my dissertation and taught for a few years, the Wilson Center was kind enough to give me a year here to write a book. And when the book came out several years later, they were kind enough to also host the book rollout, which happened in this room. So I am tremendously grateful. And to the Jackson Foundation for the funding that they afforded me in my graduate school. So it's all wonderful to be here. All right, so let me just start with the standard disclaimer that the points that I make here are my own, and they don't reflect the opinions of the State Department or of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research where I work. I can barely get my children to believe that I have any influence in the government. I don't expect you to believe it. The 2012 Apec summit in Vladivostok, which Don just talked about, was among Russia's most anticipated diplomatic events of the past decade. It was billed for years as both symbolic of and instrumental to Russia's return to the Pacific, its very own pivot to Asia. It's still very early to predict the long-term impact of that summit, and many observers caution that Russia's engagement of the Pacific lags far behind its claim of a return to Asia. I don't dismiss this prospect. However, I would like to make two fundamental points with these remarks today. First, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that Russia's rediscovery of Asia started nearly a decade ago, and not as some Johnny-come-lately response to the U.S. pivot to Asia. Second, I would like to suggest that while the United States features in Russia's Asian calculus, both positively and negatively, it doesn't define that calculus. While U.S. initiatives in Asia will usually elicit a response, often a defensive one, from Moscow, Russia's Asian initiatives are not simply reflexive. Though the United States may be the world's last remaining indispensable nation, we do not set the tempo and call the tune for everyone else, certainly not for Russia. Mistrust on both sides continues to dog the heels of our bilateral relationship, and it affects our interaction on Asia as well. However, some of our most important cooperation in the past decade, in fact, in the past 20 years, has occurred in Asia as well. And so the diplomat in me sees hope for the future. And I'm delighted to see from the previous panel that I'm not alone here. There's a foundation for regional stability and for cooperation between the United States and Russia in Asia, even among the many challenges that our relationship faces at present. So what I'd like to do today is look a little bit at Russia's turn eastward and see how that has developed over time. Talk a little bit about Russia's key relationship in East Asia, that is the Russia-China relationship, which several people have mentioned already. And then finally, talk a little bit about the so-called code of conduct that Russia has proposed for security architecture in Asia over the next several decades. Russia began its return to Asia in the mid-1990s. It was a response to the population outflow and the economic collapse that occurred in Siberia and the Russian Far East after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, however, its efforts to try and reverse this were totally underfunded, only at about 5% of the expenses in 1996 to 2000's budget were slated to come from the federal budget. So essentially, the Russians were coming up with big plans for the development of the Far East, but they were saying that basically the locals had to come up with 95% of the money to do this, which was, of course, ridiculous. The turning point seems to have been when people actually started to get serious about this in the Putin era around 2003, when the Russians drafted their energy strategy. The energy strategy basically singled out Asia's energy market for Russian exports, noting that Asia had become or was becoming the world's largest or second largest consumer of energy, and that Russia could, because of its proximity and its energy wealth, definitely benefit from this. So there was a lot more focus that was being put onto Asia as a result of this, primarily to build up the market for Russian energy exports. In 2005, Putin called for developing the untapped energy in eastern Siberia, as western Siberia was beginning to reach some of the limits of what it could develop. Putin felt that it was finally time to take advantage of eastern Siberia in expectation of the demand that was going to come from Asia in the coming years. This was quite controversial at the time. And when they began discussing in 2006 the construction of the East Siberian Pacific Ocean, the Espo Oil Pipeline, the big debate was, where the hell is all the oil going to come from? This is ridiculous. The Russians could never come up with this, the 50 million tons a year that would be necessary to keep this thing open. Incidentally, they have managed to do so reasonably well in the last couple of years. From 2004 till 2008, the investment in the Far East jumped dramatically from 103 million in 2004 to 33 billion in 2008. Moreover, 57% of these funds that were being allocated were coming from the federal budget. So a huge improvement on the late 1990s. In 2007, Russia applied for and was awarded the contract to host the 2012 Apec summit that Don was just talking about. And it announced that it would spend $10 billion to renovate Vladivostok in expectation of this. The ultimate cost, as Don just mentioned, was quite a bit higher than that. In fact, the Russians spent more on the APEC conference, which was, I believe, 3 days long, than London spent on the Olympics. So, just a little comparison. 18 billion versus 14.5 billion. So the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 really was a turning point moment, the most significant turning point since the 2003 decision to begin expanding Russia's look eastward. What happened really was that the Russians recognized that their economy was suffering dramatically as a result of the downturn in the West. And they felt that there was nothing intrinsically wrong with their own economy, as a lot of Asians felt the same way, but that the reason they were suffering was because they were overly committed to Western financial institutions and Western financial currencies. Therefore, the Russians recognized or decided that if they began shifting some of that to rebalance in the direction of Asia, their own economic situation would improve in the future, and they wouldn't be anchored down to the fortunes of the West in the future. Russian financing of Far East development, moreover, continued despite the economic downturn that occurred. And the Russian economy, as many of you, I'm sure, know, was savaged during the 2008-2009 period. And yet the funding continued. Essentially, by 2009, Foreign Minister Lavrov told a collected group of Russian chiefs of mission. There's this meeting that happens every year where all the chiefs of mission come to Moscow for a meeting with the foreign ministry. And Lavrov told them in 2009, July, that closer ties with Asia are a matter of national survival for Russia. President Medvedev later in that same year, in a speech in Singapore, said that the development of Siberia and the Russian Far East was Russia's highest priority. In 2010, the deputy foreign minister who works on Asia, Borodavkin, began writing about what they started to call the Asian vector. And the Russian Foreign Ministry actually published an article in February of 2010 on their website that was all about the importance of Russia's development towards Asia. It claimed that its contributions to the region were Espo, the oil pipeline that now was channeling Russian energy toward Asia, affordable, safe nuclear construction, and Russian nuclear construction had begun to expand in Asia and continues to do so. And the hopeful construction of what they call an Iron Silk Road that will run from Busan in South Korea all the way to Europe through the linkage of the Trans-Korean and the Trans-Siberian railroads, an objective that was begun by Sergei Witte about 100 years ago, and continues to be a key objective of the Russians in Northeast Asia today. So you might say to yourselves, well, I mean, that's ridiculous, once again, because it ignores the political situation on the Korean Peninsula. But once again, the Russians pulled a rabbit out of a hat in 2011, because when Kim Jong-il came to Russia for meetings with Medvedev, with Putin, there was an agreement that was cut that North Korea said that they would allow a gas pipeline to be built directly through North Korea into South Korea. And this was a long-term objective, both of the Russians and, incidentally, of the Russian of the South Korean President Lee as well, who had worked on this idea when he was an energy executive before going into politics. So there was this extraordinary confluence of Russia, North Korea, South Korea signing on to these trilateral projects, both the gas pipeline and the prospect that eventually this would lead to the Iron Silk Road railroad link up. Things were looking very good. And then, of course, Kim Jong-il died, and a lot of instability began to foment on the Korean Peninsula that we're, of course, seeing today. However, the Russians have not by a long shot given up this idea, and its commercial folks in Transneft continue to talk with the KOGAS partners and with the North Koreans about the prospect that when things simmer down, these projects are eventually going to create a basis for regional cooperation that is virtually unprecedented. So, you know, am I just painting a Pollyanna view of what might happen as the Russians expand their presence in Asia? Well, let's look at some of the trend lines, because really the people who argue that Russia continues to be a bit player in Asia and so is, you know, not even worth really considering. Incidentally, if you think it's bad being a Russia expert per se, try being a specialist of Russia-Asia. Boy, do the barbecues, become a problem then.
Still got a job.
Yeah, right. So, but my argument is, pay less attention to the situation as it exists right now than at the trend line. So what are the trend lines? Well, trade between Russia and Apec rose 150% in the last 4 years to 174.4 billion. Russia's trade with China, 172% between 2006 and 2011. With Japan, 137% in the same 4-year period. With South Korea, 142% in the same period. With the United States, 116%. Regional initiatives along the lines of the ones I just mentioned, as well as Russia's participation in the six-party talks format. It hosted the 2012 Apec summit. So I'm running, out of space here to talk about the relationship with China, but let me just quickly mention that essentially Russia's expansion in Asia is possible largely because of this relationship. This is what Bobo Lo has called one of the more convincing examples of positive sum international relations today. I quote this, recognizing that in the next breath I'm about to take issue with Bobo Lo's contention that this is an axis of convenience, something that is basically bound to be temporary as China's rise continues and as Russia basically distances in comparison with China. I disagree. I think that the interests that unite Russia and China are liable to continue for quite a long time. Both economically, their economic interests are comparable. The Russians sell what the Chinese need and vice versa. They do not necessarily compete very much for market share, even in Central Asia, where a lot of people have expected there to be a blow-up. The decline in demand in Europe for natural gas, which is almost certainly going to continue over the next several decades, means that Russia's access to natural gas cheaply in Central Asia is far less important to it than it once was. And as a result, the competition for access to that gas between Russia and China is almost certainly going to decline in the coming years. Add to that the fact that the foreign policy principles that others have talked about in here, the focus on sovereignty, non-interference, multilateralism in international affairs. All of these things are principles that, as long as these two countries remain the sort of authoritarian organizations that they are today, who knows if that will continue, but as long as their political systems are similar, these similarities of principle are almost certainly going to continue. And as a result, I see a very likely long-term relationship based on the same things that pull these two countries today. We can talk about this more in the question and answer if you like. Russia's regional trend lines over the past decade suggest looking beyond its currently modest, even insignificant presence in the Asia-Pacific region. It's not difficult to imagine that international developments we are seeing today could soon transform Russia, with all of its geographic and resource advantages, into a considerably more meaningful regional power. Russian trend lines in the Asia-Pacific largely point in the direction of increased engagement, and its successful staging of the Apec summit in Vladivostok last year should be seen in this light. If it's too early to talk of a Russian pivot to the Asia-Pacific, it's long overdue to recognize that a major rediscovery is afoot, one that is virtually certain to continue well into the foreseeable future. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And our third speaker is Andrew Cutchins.
I'll make sure this, whoops. Oh, there we go. Okay, how can we get, there we go, perfect. Thanks, Scott, and thanks very much to the Jackson School and the Kennan Institute for inviting me to participate on this panel and in this conference. I was not part of the University of Washington mafia, and I only met Herb Ellison once or twice in my life, but he did have a significant impact actually on my intellectual life and academic life, in that I wrote my PhD dissertation here at Johns Hopkins SAIS on the topic of Soviet policy toward China from the death of Mao until the normalization of relations in 1989. And one of the first books that I read in my graduate studies in the 1980s was the excellent edited volume done by Herb Ellison, I think while he was the director at the Kennan Institute, on the Sino-Soviet relations. Really an excellent set of essays, and I've always been a big fan of his work, and so therefore honored to be here in particular on this panel, which of course makes me think about Russia's last pivot to Asia, which was in the latter period of the Gorbachev years. It was marked by his, for the five of us following Soviet policy in Asia at that time, his famous speech in Vladivostok, which he kind of laid out what was to be, of course, Vladivostok at the time was a closed city still, about his visions for the development of Soviet ties in Asia, and they're not so dissimilar of what the Russians are up to now in many ways, although there's some significant differences. And Don, I just want to say I'm glad you mentioned the Arctic. We can make an advertisement at CSIS and the Russia-Eurasia program. We're just launching a big new project on Russia and the Arctic and the potential for U.S.-Russian cooperation. So actually, if you could send me the syllabus for your course, help me bone up on that. So, look, for a variety of economic and geostrategic reasons, the title is Russia's Energized Pivot to Asia. So I'm going to mostly be talking about kind of economic aspects of their Asia policy today, and like most other places, their comparative advantages in the energy sphere. So, for a number of economic and geostrategic reasons, Russia is now attempting to increase its efforts to develop the economy of its eastern territories and integrate more deeply in the rapidly developing Asian regional economies. We have our pivot to Asia announced by the Obama administration in 2011, and both Don and Matt talked about. I think we can say that the Russia's hosting of the Apec meeting in Vladivostok last September kind of symbolized, I think, Russia's interest in expanding its ties and its influence in Asia. And part of it is obviously in response to the changing economic balance of power that's going on in the world. And part of it is also that the Russians recognize that the multilateral institutions, both economic, political, and security institutions in Asia, are in a state of flux. And they want to have a voice in how those institutions develop. And I think that's also what the APEC meeting symbolized. Now, Gorbachev had his ideas about what to do with Asia, but principally during the Cold War period, the Soviet focus in Asia was really in the military sphere. Initially to contest to the United States and our allies, and then with the Sino-Soviet split, another topic that Herb Ellison wrote about eloquently, it was targeted toward the possibility of conflict with the People's Republic of China. But now the currency of power, I think, has really shifted to a considerable degree, as Don and others have said, from military power to economic prowess. And as energy, mainly oil and gas, have been Russia's principal economic comparative advantages in the West, Russia's economic integration in Asia leads with its energy resources. So let's kind of look at that a little bit more closely. Now, it remains critical at this point for Russia to develop the hydrocarbon resources of eastern Siberia and the Far East for three primary reasons. I'm going to give you one big caveat in a second. One, the decline of production from oil and gas deposits in western Siberia, which have been basically what the Russian economy has been living on for the Soviet legacy of investments into western Siberia going back to the 1960s. Two, the necessity of developing the economically backwards Far East. It's kind of interesting that I think Mr. Putin regards, rightfully so for somewhat different reasons, the two most vulnerable areas of the Russian Federation to be, one, the North Caucasus, and two, the Russian Far East. Interesting that he chose as a couple of his signature international events, the Sochi Olympics, 2014 next year, and the APEC summit in Vladivostok, in these areas which he views as the most vulnerable. Now, of course, they've received tremendous amounts of investment, as been noted by our panelists before. Maybe not the most effectively invested investments, but that remains to be seen. But the third point about Russia's this need is Russia's deep concerns over the possibility. Big reason why they feel about the vulnerability of the Russian Far East is China, and the possibility of Chinese encroachment in the Far East. And the most pressing is the decline of the large oil and gas deposits in western Siberia that have historically served as the backbone for the Russian oil and gas sectors. Now, let me say, there's one big caveat here. I mean, Russia's talking. They're talking about investing in the Arctic. They're talking about investing. They are making investments in eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East in the energy sector. But the big variable is something that Jill Doherty referred to earlier, and that is the potential for shale oil in the western Siberian fields. The main reason why BP and why ExxonMobil, other big international oil companies, are signing deals right now with Rosneft, interested in other deals with Rosneft, is to explore the potential for the shale oil deposits in western Siberia. Literally, right around the time that Jill mentioned that, a colleague sent me an article. I'll just read the the title of it to you. One of my energy program colleagues at CSIS. Yeah. Sorry, just a second. Well, you get the picture.
You can Google it.
Mega deal between BP, basically to look at the shale oil deposits. Okay. So the production of those fields have been declining. And with these large deposits, unless manna from heaven, the shale oil resolves these problems, then the focus of the oil and gas sectors is set to shift towards medium and smaller scale deposits in hard to recover reserves, and in different geological locations. Read expensive oil and expensive gas. All of this is going to require immense private sector, public sector, and foreign investment on the scale of the largest capital expenditure projects in the history of humanity. Yes, thank you. Humanity. It's big. Now, the Russian development plan for the eastern regions that Matt alluded to is predicated on the idea that these fields can quickly be brought online to make up for these production shortfalls anticipated in western Siberia to create a stable oil and gas sector, once again capable of expansion. Quickly. We'll see. Now, the contribution of the new fields in eastern Siberia and the Far East, what happens with that? What happens with the decline, or maybe the lack of decline, of the western Siberia fields? I mean, this has a dramatic effect on both Russia's geopolitical position and its public finances. Oil alone provides over half of Russia's export revenue. Oil and gas profits account for up to 50% of the federal, about 70% of the federal budget. And unlike many of the other major oil and gas exporters, Russia also suffers from a dearth of spare capacity, meaning that while significant modernization and development of the eastern sections, it will be unable to maintain current levels of oil and gas exports. In fact, the Russian energy strategy calls for expansion of oil and gas exports overall, and this is in part driven by a desire to diversify Russia's export portfolio away from traditional export markets to Europe. So let's just look at the overall Russian trade portfolio. A little data interruption. Okay, the Russian bilateral trade with select countries, and there's one not select country, and that's the EU. And you see that's the tall line. And the EU accounts for today about 50% of Russia's trade. Now you can't really see these colors very well, so maybe this chart will make it look a little bit different. Okay, this is bilateral trade with select countries, not including the EU. So on the far end of 2012, you see the Russia-China trade relationship, which is number 1. Behind it is Germany, number 2. And then also in third place is Turkey, and then also listed there are South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Now, you can see that the German-Russian bilateral trade relationship was number 1 until, not surprisingly, 2009. And that's when China overtook Germany as Russia's number 1 trade partner, and for the foreseeable future, I don't think that will ever change. Here are the actual numbers for 2012. So, $87 billion for China, $410 billion for the European Union. Again, about 50% of Russia's overall trade, and you see the other figures. Now, the Russians and the Chinese have set the goals of raising that bilateral trade to $100 billion in 2015, certainly reachable, and $200 billion in 2020. More of a question mark. A big factor here is, well, let me show these next. Here are bilateral trade with select countries as a percentage of total trade. Wait, we've already seen that, haven't we? Yeah. Okay, here's the share of petroleum oil and oil byproducts to these countries. And oil, and again, this is you take out the EU, and you can see how those relationships work. Okay. Now, this picture is significant. Where is the figure for Russian exports of natural gas to China? It's not there. It's because those exports are zero. It's because the Russians and the Chinese have not been able to agree on price. for a long time. Now, I've been asked this question so many times, I think if I had $1 for every time I was asked, when are the Russians and the Chinese going to agree about a price on gas? I would not be here speaking to you today. I'd be somewhere in Aruba or a sunnier place. And every time I've been asked that question, I've said it's not going to happen. At least before this summit meeting or that whatever meeting. Now, I was asked this question last week at a conference at GW on the eve of Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow, and my response was, I don't know. It wasn't no, it was I don't know. As it turns out, they did not agree upon the price. They're still not there, but they've committed to agreeing upon price by the end of this year, and they've agreed upon quantities of gas, 38 BCM, possibly increases to 68 BCM over the next few years. But they're going to agree on this sooner or later. It's not a matter of whether; it's simply a matter of when. And I actually would be reasonably confident they would agree upon the price of gas exports to the Chinese. Now, one thing that they did agree with Beijing last week was that Beijing would get upstream equity in Russian oil fields, in 3 oil fields. This is a pretty important development because it gets to what is the key point I want to make in this presentation, and that is, Russia's pivot to Asia. It's all about China, and it's all about how they manage their relationship with China. And the Russians are deeply concerned about becoming over-leveraged to China or being the victim of a leveraged buyout by China. And for the Russians, when you talk about sovereignty, they understand the basis of their sovereignty. It's financial sovereignty. It's economic sovereignty. Putin understands this extremely clearly. And so it wasn't until 2005 when the Russians paid off their IMF debt early. 2006 they paid off their Paris Club debt early. That's when the term sovereign democracy emerged. That's when Mr. Putin felt that the Russians had become sovereign. Now, what's one of it's this concern about Chinese overwhelming, growing financial and economic power. It's not going to be a military conflict or a nuclear conflict. It's the concern about the Chinese getting too much power over Russian assets, and the most valuable Russian assets are those in the oil and gas field. This is what Mr. Putin feels so strongly about. This is what the Yukos case was all about. This is what the vertical of power is all about. This is why he is the 3 most powerful people in the Russian Federation today. Probably are Vladimir Putin, Mr. Sechin, and Mr. Zubkov. Okay, they're all the thing is they're controlling the hydrocarbon assets, and they're also controlling the files, the financial monitoring of all other major business people in the Russian Federation. So I'm a little bit off base or just sort of off the topic there, but it's this sensitivity to how you deal with China. So what's the strategy? Thanks. 3 minutes. You're generous, Scott. It's more than I expected.
Don't shoot the messenger.
No. So what's the strategy? And you can see with this. First of all, I agree very much with Matt in his critique, Matthew, with his critique of. Can I give you like a George W. Bush nickname?
Sure.
Of Bobo Lowe's characterization of the Sino-Russian relationship as an axis of convenience. For Moscow, this is not an axis of convenience. This is an axis of necessity, absolute necessity. This is going to be your biggest trade and economic partner for as far as the eye can see. You share the longest border, in the world. It's been a border that has been highly contested over the 400 years, ever since Chinese and Russians came into contact with each other. Yes, Mr. Putin likes to say that the Russian-Chinese relationship today is better than it's ever been, but in some ways that's kind of a low bar. This has been a pretty contentious history, right? And actually, I think you could make a pretty good argument that maybe the period of eternal friendship in the 1950s, which lasted about 10 years, it's kind of like the Third Reich, it was supposed to last for 1,000 years, lasted for 12. That actually that was a period of a closer relationship because of the security guarantees in the Sino-Soviet relationship, et cetera. But that's an argument. So how does Russia manage this? Well, actually, the answer is pretty simple. One, okay, China is the biggest demandeur hydrocarbon resources and other natural commodities. Ironically, the Russians talk about this as a problem, like it's a big problem becoming a natural resource appendage of China. Gee, I don't know. This looks like one of the most complementary economic relationships you can manage. What's so bad about it? Okay, well, it's bad if you don't have a competitive marketplace and you don't have other demandeurs that are competing for those resources. So not only are they competing for the resources, but they're also going to be competing over the investment opportunities in these fields. So China's going to be number one, but you're going to improve relations with Japan. Japan has an interest, and actually already the Russians are. Russian oil and gas constitutes about 10% of Japanese imports of oil and gas. You're going to work with the Koreans, okay? You're going to work with ASEAN. And who's going to be your number one partner in ASEAN? Well, it's going to be Vietnam. And boy, if you really want to get inside the Chinese wheelhouse, you start going into the South China Sea and developing gas fields that Vietnam claims, and you start selling the Vietnamese a lot more arms. I was laughing when a Japanese colleague told me he was at a conference this summer in Moscow. There are no Americans there. And the Chinese were very vocally complaining about the Russian arms sales to Vietnam. Ha! Boy, now you know what it was like for us to feel like, huh? The Russians don't like to be told who they can sell and who they can not sell their arms to, for sure. So good luck with that one. I was also surprised to see that the Russians do not want to get in the middle of this territorial dispute between the Chinese and the Japanese. So it was really quite surprising to see that in September, the Chinese ambassador to Moscow said publicly that basically he was very disappointed that the Russians were not being more supportive of the Chinese position in the Senkaku-Daewoo conflict. He actually said that while Mr. Patrushev, the head of the Russian National Security Council and maybe the number 4 or 5 guy in the Putinology hierarchy, was in Tokyo. And so, of course, the press had to ask him about this. And, what's he going to say? Look, Russia's not going to take sides in this. This must be resolved peacefully. And this is a matter for, Japan and China to work out. So I'm a little bit, I would put more caveats on the Russia-China relationship. I agree with Matthew that it's not over conflict in Central Asia, but it's more about Asia itself and Russia's presence in Asia, and especially in the development of the resources that the Russians have and that the Russians cannot develop on their own. So this is why the Russians are going to bring in the international oil companies and other international companies for the development of those resources, and they're going to ideally, create. The smart thing for them to do is actually create a better investment environment that makes it more attractive for the others to compete over them, rather than to sell them in undervalued prices and be effectively more leveraged by Beijing. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. We have about a half hour for questions now, and a lot of food for thought. Any questions?
I think they're full.
When's lunch?
Please identify yourself. Steve.
Steve Hansen from William & Mary. My question is about domestic politics in China, which didn't come up a lot in the panel, and how that affects the relationship. So the argument that's typically made against the more optimistic view that's been the primary theme of the panel about Russian-China relations is that culturally most people in both societies have a lot of suspicion still. The Russians, if you talk to, almost anybody, talk about the secret plot to take over Siberia and the Russian Far East, unequal treaties. In China, there's a general sense that Russia was a partner way back when in the Dark Ages and now doesn't matter much. At least when I go to China, that's what I hear. Except people over 80 who still speak Russian, so that's nice. So the argument is that although right now the geopolitical interests of the two sides, as has been pointed out very, very well, are in line, and the regimes are similar. Both regimes face domestic pressures that are significant enough, even if you don't predict some kind of immediate change, that we could imagine regime change, we could imagine significant shifts in policy that are driven by those pressures from below. And in that case, those cultural antipathies might come out in ways which would prohibit those sorts of long-term deals from being struck. I'm just reflecting, really, and wondering if the panel has any reaction to that argument.
Sure. I think that I allowed myself an escape hatch on this question. You might remember when I said, as long as they remain, the countries that they are today. It is to a certain degree difficult to predict, any revolutionary situation. I mean, we're currently facing the changes in the Middle East right now, and clearly many of our early expectations are being revised. So it's difficult to respond to that. However, a couple of, and I should also point out, I'm not a China specialist, but I do work with a lot of China specialists, and we do discuss these things. And so the question or the point I would think is really important here is that there is very few people in China who actually hearken back to 19th century China and desperately want Siberia back. Right. A lot of the sort of China threat theory and everything that was quite popular in Russia even 10 years ago has been significantly diminished. It's very difficult to actually find many Russians who really understand international relations who believe that there's going to be some sort of revanchist bid by the Chinese to take this territory. It's much more along the lines of what Andy said recently, the recent changes in economic purchasing and investment and that kind of thing, that could have an encroaching effect on Russian sovereignty, but certainly not this kind of a military threat. There is almost no clear constituency in China right now for that kind of revanchism outside of serious fringe elements. Occasionally, you see them in the blogosphere, but you really don't see them among any sort of organized groups. Does that answer your question? I don't mean to dismiss it. It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, the ideas of the argument is it's the cultural part of it that isn't.
Oh, yeah, and let me just suggest that you look at it, an actual expert on this. Gil Rosman has done recent work on this question of to what extent are these two cultures very similar, and to what extent do those cultural similarities actually tie them together more ably than a lot of people actually expect. So I'm going to beg off on this, but I would turn you to Gil's work. I think it's very good.
One response. Yes, I guess the notion that of the compatibility of Russian and Chinese cultures strikes me as being too broad, not just for this conference, but for almost anywhere. And that the issue within Russia, which emerged, I guess it was in 2011, they had a conference, and I might mention that all of my trips to Moscow were on rubles, not dollars, which is really interesting to me. In any event, the first session was an opportunity for the Russians themselves to stand up and ask questions, which the topic of this conference is about. What is Russia's role in Asia? And I was prepared to make up for jet lag, because what these individuals thought about this really was interesting, but personal. But instead, it turned into be a shouting match in which, my grandfather was, Asian, and we are part of it. And it was somewhat divided between the apparatchiks, which were, I suppose, they were all older, obviously, but they were very adamant that Russia was, and in any event, the debate was very emotional. The American ambassador was there, and he was totally taken back, didn't really understand. I'm not sure I understood it fully. But I really think that's an issue internal to Russia. I don't think that I would agree totally with what was just said here about no policy decision is going to do that. On the other hand, my second point would be that these charts here reflect in part this deal that was cut a few years ago. And you know what the Chinese got their oil for? $40 a barrel. They absolutely hit the bottom of when it went from 147 down to 40 or 39. They held out and got it for it. And the Russians are furious. Their perception of it is not just that they were bad. They had to do this. I mean, it was a timing of money and budget and stuff. And that's one of the reasons why people at Imemont and elsewhere said, we want a multilateral framework. Otherwise, we're driven in large part by the prices of natural resources, especially those fossil fuels related to energy. And to the extent that policy is relevant, it's relevant on those practical terms, not in terms of this broader thing. The other fact is that the population in Siberia and that is still, if not diminishing, it's scant and unlikely to increase, and there are a lot of Chinese.
Okay, despite what you're going to read on that, Scott, do you mind if I make a comment? It says, get lunch quickly. Steve, I think the critical factor is going to be Chinese behavior. And I think the Russians followed, obviously, they follow extremely closely. They follow debates within the Chinese international security, most of their foreign policy elites. Alexander Lukin, who has, in the Russian context, would typically be termed a panda hugger. He wrote a very interesting article that came out about a year and a half ago in this obscure Bulgarian journal, but in English, in which he said, look, there is this school of more nationalistic, more expansionistic, more assertive, Chinese foreign policy that the Russians are very concerned about for understandable reasons. And I think that part of the Russian interest in resetting relations with the United States in 2009 was exactly the perception that coming out of the global economic crisis, that the obvious winner from their standpoint and from most others was China, and they were a relative loser, and that it didn't make sense for the Russians to have such a terrible relationship with Washington when they have this growing power on their border. That is Vladimir Putin's already, I think, biggest challenge to manage for now and into the future. I was surprised to learn, kind of shocked to learn actually, that the Chinese actually made a border claim in the Altai region. Supposedly in 2004, the border treaty resolved the Sino-Russian border for here to eternity. But now the Chinese have come forward with a border claim of about 17 kilometers in the Altai region. Very, very interesting and surprising. And I'm sure from the Russian standpoint, they would think this would be a slippery slope. This is not a precedent. That's not a box they want to go into. So I think there are contending schools of thought in China about this. The Russians have seen more assertive Chinese foreign behavior, 2009, 2010, especially the kind of a break, and then suddenly in this past year, the concatenation of border disputes with Japan, Philippines, and they have one with South Korea as well, and that's very, very worrisome. So I'll leave it at that.
Let me just add one thing about the cultural thing. If you don't look at the actual change of government or whatever, which is difficult to predict, I do think that there's an important cultural affinity right now, and that it comes from the fact that both of these countries have troublesome both human rights records and development of democracy records, even though both countries actually claim to be trying to do those two things. They both face constant criticism from the West. Moreover, both are dealing with nationalistic, I should say, minority nationalities that are basically spin-offs and trying to break away from the country. So they are putting these down by force and also getting a lot of criticism for that. So as a result, you have China is the only country in the world that has supported Russia almost, flatly on the question of Chechnya. And Russia is one of the few, if not the only, that has supported China unquestionably on Tibet, on Xinjiang, and on Taiwan. So, they have each other's backs on these very important cultural issues that, as far as I can tell, are going to stick around for quite a while.
Okay, we're shorter on time than I thought. I'm going to take a group of questions. Everybody will have a chance to respond to those and other things if you want. And I urge everybody on both sides to be brief with what little authority I have. So let's start in the back.
Thank you. Richard White's Hudson Institute. A question about the weekend summit, the arms deals that were announced. The Russian press is a bit contradictory in what they agreed to, and so I was wondering if you had any insights on this. And just more generally, how do people think about the revival of the Russian arms trade to China when we thought maybe a couple of years ago that it was going to go down to minuscule amounts, just simple replacement of spares and so on?
Angela.
I wanted to sort of follow on what Steve raised, and that is, again, to challenge the idea that there's some qualitatively new development here with Russia as an Asian power. I mean, yes, they've signed agreements, and yes, from the Russian point of view, they need the Chinese access of necessity, if you like, for economic reasons. But if you talk to the Chinese about their relationship with Russia, they'll say it's great. They support us on all these important foreign policy issues. They've already been mentioned: Taiwan, Tibet, multipolar world, sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. Then you start talking to the Chinese about what they think about the way the Russian political and economic system is organized, and they're pretty derogatory. And I haven't really heard, any change in that view. So I would say for them, it's still an axis of convenience. And as you pointed out, they got a fantastic deal with the energy deals. I mean, they were paying prices. They really hoodwinked the Russians on that. And then, if you talk to the Russians, they fear becoming a raw materials appendage of China, even though right now they need to be a raw materials appendage of China. And they do have concerns about China's long-term goals, particularly, none of you mentioned demographics, but, you have a depopulated Russian Far East, and we don't need to say any more about the Chinese population. So I would just challenge that and say, yes, at the moment, this is a convenient relationship. I think the Chinese president went to Russia also partly because he wanted to make a statement to the United States, and I guess we read that. And the final point is, where do the Russian and Chinese elites send their children to study and be trained? Most of the Chinese party elites' children are at Harvard or Princeton, and in the Russian case, they're either in Europe or they're also at Harvard or Yale and Princeton. So I think that tells us something, too.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
So, dear Koa from the Naval Academy, there are talks about establishing an Far Eastern version of the IMF with China, Japan, and Russia. What would Russia's role be in that system, and how would America possibly react to such a system being established?
I could take a couple more. In front.
My name is Brandon Wright. I'm an IT consultant currently contracting with DHS. A few years ago, Professor Hellman was my advisor for my master's thesis, and perhaps passing me might be a decision he regrets to this day. So my question was, there was a lot of thought-provoking discussion about energy and security. My professional interest is, and an issue that I didn't hear discussed was the role of technology. And when we have China, I mean, we can think about Alibaba, their e-commerce firm, which last year they took in over 170 billion in cash. That's more than Amazon and eBay combined. And so with Russia, currently most places in the world look to the West and to the U.S. for their technology best practices, developing their infrastructure and managing their information. And I'm wondering, with China's explosive growth and development with technology, is there room for Russia to reevaluate its strategic position and to look towards China for developing its technology and information management infrastructure? Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, I know our panelists are all expert at being concise, so I don't need to remind them that they're the last thing standing between everybody here and lunch. So let's start. Don.
Let me start with the last question first, because that was the most interesting point that was made at the meeting I attended in Beijing. And I used to nominally run a Center for Internet Studies, so I'm very interested in this whole issue. The Chinese tried to set up a panel on how to manage a network political economy, and I was asked to be a member of it. Needless to say, I said I didn't know enough to get involved in it, and they eventually canceled the panel. So at the conference the last day, some guy appeared out of nowhere and made a really interesting statement that the development of the Chinese blogosphere, the fact that the people that run China, the 2.5 million professionals, spend 20 hours a day on computers, that computer communication is horizontal. Our party is structured vertically. It's an institution-killing arrangement, and we don't know what to do, and it's a problem for you. And he shook his finger at me. You have to deal with as well as ourselves. So, I applauded and took notes. The next person to speak came out of nowhere, identified himself as a colonel in the People's Liberation Army and said, that's all hysterical. We will develop a civil society and our country will prosper. Clearly, they have no idea how to deal with the internet. They obviously have the capacity to compete with us and other people in this realm. And that's an extremely important point. One I would reiterate when I say institutions there. Absolutely, you have to deal with this whole issue of cybersecurity. And the only other one I will respond to is the IMF question, which is really a legacy from the Asian financial crisis. The smaller countries of Asia, Thailand in particular, responded by trying to create a Chiang Mai initiative, a pool of reserves so that the Asians were not dependent on the IMF and its resources, which have been, of course, vastly expanded because of the recent recession. I was a little taken back by that because the Chinese, of course, threw a little money, about $1 billion at it, but it was never, when the Great Recession hit, it was never even mentioned. I took the statement that was actually in the morning paper, yesterday's paper, I can't remember, glanced at it, by the BRICS that said they were going to pool resources to be very interesting. It's not so much an Asian-Russian question as much as it is an emerging countries question and a way of kind of sticking their tongue out at the IMF and the financial system as it currently exists. Whether it works or not, that's another issue. I wouldn't go there. But the resources are simply there for them to do it. And since the Chinese sit on $3.3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, it could possibly be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, on Russian arm trade with China, there has been a decline since 2005, largely because the Chinese have developed their own indigenous arms sector, and in part from stealing ideas from the Russians. That's the other influence on the decline. However, there is not a clear line that you can draw between the Russians losing information technology or I should say IPO issues to the Chinese and the decline. Basically, the Russians will sell anything to the Chinese if the Chinese buy enough of them. The idea is basically they're going to steal it anyway, let's make some money. So up until now, basically after 2005, there really wasn't any billion-plus orders in the relationship for years until I think last year there was a $3 billion order for aircraft engines. This seems to be the one thing that the Chinese still can't do well, and as a result, they're putting Russian aircraft engines in some of the export models of their aircraft that are going out, as well as the domestic aircraft. At the most recent meeting, Xi's visit over the weekend, there really was quite a surprising development. The Russians agreed to sell 24 Su-35s to the Chinese. This was a lot fewer than we expected. The Russians wanted to make, basically the Chinese asked them several years ago to sell them 2. Gee, what are you going to do with 2 Su-35s, right? So the Russians said, hell no, how stupid do you think we are? So basically the Russians countered with a much larger number, and there seems to have been, 48, and there seems to have been a negotiation that got that down to 24. So it's surprising that the Russians got rolled for this little. So that was important. As far as Angela's comments on the derogatory views of the Chinese, of the Russian government and whatnot. Absolutely accurate. I still, however, stand by the notion that many of the economic interests, the kind of complementarity in economic, in economies that Andy talked a little bit about, and the foreign policy principles that are rooted on those cultural issues I mentioned to Steve, are long-term, and they are going to continue maintaining the kind of relationship that they have now, I believe, for the foreseeable future. This notion that the Russians are a natural resource appendage to China is just nonsense. Russia is a natural resource appendage to the world. It exports, successfully, with the exception of nuclear reactors and armaments. So it's just a silly argument, and I would encourage you to use that counter with the Russians and see what they have to say the next time. Then the Far Eastern IMF, honestly, I haven't the slightest idea what you're talking about. Maybe you can catch me afterwards and tell me what that proposal was, because I'm just not familiar with that idea. So I'd be interested to know more. And then finally, I know absolutely nothing about information management, so my apologies. I can't answer that. Yeah.
Great questions. I think that Matthew covered the arms deal effectively. To me, the question there, Richard, is, is Russia again working on its own military modernization? Who are they going to be partnering with on R&D, development, et cetera? And I would just say I think it's strongly in our interest, U.S. interests, that they be looking more in this direction rather than in the direction of China. I don't know about the IMF, but I think that the point that Don is making about I was asked by a Chinese colleague from Shanghai who was going to the BRICS meeting this week. So, what do you think the Russians think about the BRICS and how useful it is? Well, I don't exactly know what the Russians think, but this is how I would think about it. I would see that the BRICS would be a group of countries that would be looked to have some similar interest that they would want to lobby for in reform of the international financial architecture. But the format where that's probably going to take place would be the G20, because there it's more inclusive. But there's some things that the BRICS, maybe in their own context, can get lined up together on, and then pursue in a more unified position. Culture, I think there's deeper culture, and there are common political interests. I agree with Matthew that they have common political and economic interests that are pretty long-standing, but I think the deeper cultural ties are pretty much zero. I mean, let's be honest, okay? I mean, the disdain which Chinese hold Russians is extremely high. For a lot of reasons, including the one that Angela mentioned. One of their favorite topics to study is the collapse of the Soviet Union, why that happened. We don't repeat it. This also has foreign policy implications for China, because a big problem for the Soviets overextended themselves. They basically had an aggressive foreign policy. They created an alliance system of all the most powerful and wealthy countries in the world. Smart move. And the Chinese don't want to repeat that aspect of this as well. The final point, I think, is where the Russians, I think, want to see themselves perhaps in the context of China, the United States, and Russia, that if it is a G2 world, but it's a more conflictual G2 world, then the Russians would want to see themselves as kind of a swing state that Washington and Beijing would compete for to some extent, somewhat analogous to the role that Beijing held in the late 60s, early 1970s, vis-a-vis the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
Thanks. Before thanking our panelists, I need to give some instructions. So the plan now is that because there's lunch sitting outside, everybody can go and get your lunch and bring it back here, and you can eat during the next roundtable discussion. We urge you to come back to your seats about 10 minutes from now. If it ends up being a little longer, that's okay, but please do your best to come back within 10 minutes. And now we can thank our panelists for a great discussion.
Misread me. I didn't mean to correct you on
Go ahead.
that.
He's got everyone on the same page. You're not an oddball anymore. Oh, sorry.
If you call me that, that's fine. Just call me